Well, good morning. It is Thursday, August 26th, and we have gathered for morning devotion again using Brian McLaren's Seeking Aliveness, and today we begin with a new reading, and this one is from Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. For we are called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single command: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. And so today's devotion is called A Common Reality. Slavery was a sad and common reality in the ancient world. There are at least 4 ways that a person can become a slave. First, when people suffered a terrible misfortune like sickness, accident, flood, debt, theft, or famine, they could quickly find themselves in danger of death by starvation or homelessness. In that desperate situation, they might be forced to sell themselves into slavery under the simple reasoning that being a live slave was better than being a dead non-slave. Second, when nations won a war, they often killed off all of their vanquished enemies. But some nations decided to keep their defeated foes alive as slaves instead of killing them. Third, refugees or other vulnerable minorities might be enslaved by the dominant majority. And finally, babies born to slaves were destined to be slaves. That's what happened to the descendants of Abraham between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus in the Bible. As Genesis ended, Joseph had welcomed his brothers into Egypt as refugees to escape a famine in their land to the north. Finding refuge solved the famine problem, but refugees and minority status made them vulnerable to enslavement. As Exodus began, the Hebrews, as Abram's descendants were then called, had been enslaved. And they have grown in number so much so that the Egyptians had begun to fear that they might rebel. In response, the Egyptian ruler, the Pharaoh, called for a gradual genocide by decreeing that all the male babies of the Israelite slaves be thrown into the Nile to drown. You can see how the strategy would have leave the next generation of Hebrew women either barren or vulnerable to sexual enslavement by Egyptian men. After one generation, no more pure Hebrew would be born. And so this is a tough reading that Brian has before us. So we know the story that, after Joseph's death, the offspring of Jacob of Israel remained in Egypt, and they became slaves for 400 years or so. And during that time, the Egyptian pharaohs saw that they had increased in numbers, and he enslaved them, and he wanted them to disappear. And so he set into motion a plan to get rid of them by killing the babies in the Nile and drowning them. It's not a pretty story. It's not a pleasant story. And sometimes we don't like to hear those stories in the Bible. But we know the end of the story. We know what happens in Exodus as Exodus opens up with Moses and Passover and the escape out of Egypt. But this common place that he is talking about is this place of slavery, and how slavery was so important to the economies of the time of Egypt and even in Israel to some extent. Slavery was important. It was important to our founding nation as well. It's not right, we get that, but it was important to the economies. And so this common place was this idea that slaves existed and that the rulers ruled over the slaves. And whatever the rulers said to do, the slaves had to do. It's not fair, it's not right, but it's a part of the history that we don't like to talk about. So there's this common place of back then, and even to some extent today, where we have slaves, where we have servants. It's a common place in our Bible. The story continues, even though it may have changed the ways in which servants have been acted and treated, that story still takes place. And so I want us to look around our society and see where servants and slavery still exist. It does, even in our society. Look at those places where slavery exists, where it's a common theme that we have way back to the beginning of Genesis. It goes for thousands and thousands of years. It's not right again, but it's there. And so just reflect on your society and where do you see those slaves?